Okay, welcome back. Let's keep going with personal protective equipment, PPE. Now we'll talk about masks. And you guys have a pretty good idea why we'd use a mask, of course. The mask is going to prevent droplets from leaving a person's mouth, and to a certain extent, it'll help prevent droplets from getting into your mouth. Masks are often used for respiratory and reverse isolation. Patients with respiratory infections should be masked before they're transported, because we don't want them to spread infection as they move through a hospital or as they move through while they're being transported. Sorry. Wet masks are not effective. So as soon as a mask gets wet, it needs to be changed. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize, and that's why you've heard in the news recently that masks are often being misused or used in the wrong way, and they're actually not providing any help in certain circumstances because they're not being used properly. If you should touch a mask, you should wash your hands immediately. It shouldn't be something that you should put off or slow down or waste time at. You should wash your hands immediately, and then generally if you're touching that mask with your hands, it's a good idea to think of that mask as being contaminated and it needs to be changed. Okay, another piece of personal protective equipment. You guys won't necessarily come in contact with this a lot in a dental clinic, but it's certainly something that allied health workers and doctors and nurses would use, which would be a gown. And a lot of times a gown is used prevent pathogens, bacteria, or even contaminants from spreading from the healthcare worker to the patient. It can also be worn to protect the healthcare worker from the patient if they're contagious with anything in particular. They're generally worn in every isolation room. When someone's in an isolation room, you want to prevent or you want to reduce as much contaminants as possible, so a gown always helps. Gowns are only worn once. You don't wear a gown a second time. Once you take it off, it goes in to be laundered, or it goes into the biohazard bin to be destroyed. When you remove a gown, you fold it so that the outside is facing in. So you fold it in on itself, and what that does is it contains anything that could have been contaminated on the outside of the gown on the inside. So the inside part of the gown acts as a barrier between anything that's contaminated on the outside of the gown. As soon as the gown gets wet, it's useless and it needs to be changed immediately. Okay, so talking about gowns, let's talk about cleaning of patient care equipment now. Whenever a patient comes into your care, they're going to come in contact with equipment. They're going to come in contact with things you need to use in order to treat them. Some of this equipment is going to be contaminated with many different things. It can be contaminated with blood, body fluids, secretions, excretions, and these things had to be handled very carefully. If you think about how we handle stuff in labs, you're going to get an idea of how we do the same thing in a healthcare setting. Reusable equipment, for example, it's going to need to be cleaned. It's going to be disinfected or sterilized depending on the type of equipment and depending on the nature of cleanliness that it needs. So some of these things could go in the autoclave. Some of these things will be cleaned down with a very powerful disinfectant so that it can be used again for another patient. But it needs to be treated accordingly before it can be used again in order to prevent the spread of disease. We'll have to properly dispose of single-use items, so things that come in contact with any of those bodily fluids or blood or anything, those will be properly disposed of. And you can see here there's an example of a biohazard box, just like we have in the lab. For one-time uses, we put them in so that even though they're contaminated, they won't contaminate anybody else, and they're safely taken care of so nobody else becomes infected. Visibly contaminated items, so if you had a gown that ended up with blood on it or large amounts of bodily fluids, then that would need to be bagged and removed. And if you think about the biohazard boxes we have in the lab, the yellow boxes, inside those yellow boxes there's a big orange bag, and those are special biohazard bags, and we use those to put contaminated items in. Disposal of sharps, so anything that can cause you harm: needles, scalpels, syringes, glass slides. These are all things that are considered sharps. They cannot go in a regular garbage bag or bin because they could stick out from the bag and they could cause infection to the people handling our waste. So these would go in specialized containers, and you can see here generally a sharp will go into a rigid or a plastic box or container so that it cannot stab or stick into anybody or cause them to be cut or scratched, and this greatly reduces people's chances of infection. A needle stick is a very dangerous situation in a hospital setting. For this reason, we never recap used needles. So in the picture here, you can see the person is trying to put the needle back into the cap, and they miss for some reason, and they end up sticking their finger. And now whatever that needle has come into contact, and it could be HBV, it could be HIV, for example. These could be deadly infections to healthcare workers. So we never recap a used needle. We generally take a needle when it's finished and it goes directly into a sharps disposal so that it can't cause any more damage. Whenever a needle has come in contact with somebody, it should be considered biohazardous and it should be treated with the utmost care. Okay, now we do take precautions that are based on different modes of transmission. So if we know a pathogen is being spread a certain way, then we can take precautions to prevent the spread of that pathogen because we know how it's being spread. Now, generally when we're talking about transmission, and this was the first couple of slides of this unit, we talk about those three types of transmission. First was contact, then we talked about vehicle, and then we talked about vector. The vector, of course, is going to be a living object. A vehicle is going to be a non-living object, and contact refers to direct contact between people, either directly, indirectly, or by droplet. Now, this is in the general population, in a general setting. If we were to move this to a hospital, we're basically worried about vehicle transmission. The pathogen could be airborne, or we're worried about contact transmission, and mostly droplet. For coronavirus 2, which is the COVID-19, we are specifically worried about contact and droplet, and then of course there's other parts of the vehicle transmission that we need to be worried about as well. In a hospital transmission, we can generally get rid of vectors. I mean, hopefully when you go to a hospital you don't see lots of flies driving around or flying around, or insects or mice or rodents. So vectors generally aren't a thing. And for the most part, since we can control what food and water we serve patients, we can control most vectors. So contact and vehicle, more specifically the airborne vehicle, are what we need to worry about when we're talking about hospital transmission. Okay, let's have a look at airborne precautions first. And remember, airborne transmission is when the pathogen is suspended in air, either on dust particles or water vapor particles. And if you walk through a room with an airborne pathogen, simply breathing it in can cause disease. So you need to be quite careful when in an airborne situation. Some of the things we need to be worried about when we're talking about airborne precautions are the dust particles that float in the air, and airborne droplet nuclei. Now, I mentioned nuclei in a previous slide, and what the nuclei are basically dried droplets. A droplet comes out of somebody's mouth, and it's got saliva, it's got liquid, it's got water in it, but it also has other particles in it, and it has the pathogen we're talking about. If that droplet lands on a surface, for example, eventually the water will evaporate and we're just left with whatever particles were left in it. most notably the pathogen. And if we know a bit about that pathogen, we know it can survive on a surface for X number of hours. And from right now, from what I've heard different stories, but we're saying that COVID-19 can happily live on a surface for anywhere between, I've heard 9 hours in some cases, and I've heard other people say as long as 9 days. So this is why we're being very careful to sanitize everything, and you need to be very careful washing your hands if you handle doorknobs or handrails or anything like that, because of these droplets. Now, to take precautions for an airborne situation, we need to be careful if somebody has the infection. So if you have a cough or a cold, for example, and you need to cough, what we recommend is coughing into your elbow. And this is often called the vampire cough. And if you think about that, if you think about a vampire, very often you'll see them take their arm and hold their cape up over their head, and it looks like their mouth is in their elbow. Well, that's why they call it the vampire cough. There used to be an absolutely amazing video on YouTube about the vampire cough. It was so horrible. It was brilliant. But they seem to have taken that off now, which is a real shame. I think I've watched it 1,000 times. It's too bad. If I can find it, I'll post it. So apart from vampire coughing, we limit the number of persons in a room. We dust the room with a damp cloth. We don't want to have anything dry to spread the droplets around anymore. Allow fresh air and sunlight to get in the room. UV can be a disinfectant, as well as fresh air can help remove some of the pathogens that are there. And if you're changing linens in a bed, for example, you roll the linens in so that any of the linen that's exposed is now inside a ball of bedclothes. So hopefully you keep the pathogen or the airborne particles down. Now these two right here you're hearing a lot about right now, because COVID-19 it's not necessarily an airborne disease, it's a droplet-borne disease, but these things right here limit the number of droplets and hopefully will help keep you safe. Limit the number of people in a room now is basically being called social distancing. For contact transmission, and this is the most common form, shaking hands, somebody who's infected touching a patient. Contact transmission is the most common form transmission of all nosocomial infections. A nosocomial infection is an infection that you've got or you've obtained from a healthcare facility. So a nosocomial infection is something you get if you go to a hospital to get treated and you get a secondary infection. From a healthcare center, we call it a nosocomial. So for contact precautions, basically if we know someone has the pathogen, we just prevent contact with them either directly or indirectly. It's not as easy as said as done, but you do your best. The droplet transmission, this is the one we're quite worried about now because of COVID-19. This occurs when droplets, which are a little bit greater than 5 micrometers in diameter, they contain the microbes and they're propelled a short distance through the air. So right now we're telling people to stay 1 meter away from each other, because generally droplets, when someone's talking or even coughing, they're heavy, they tend to come out of the mouth and fall down within 1 meter. So droplets are produced by coughing, sneezing, talking, and then of course some procedures too. If you're suctioning a patient in a dental's office, that's going to cause suctioning. Droplets are big, they're heavy, so they don't stay in the air quite for a very long time. They tend to fall and they land on surfaces. For droplet precautions, you'd put a patient in a private room. They don't require special air handling. You'd wear a mask, and you'd also make sure the patient wears a mask during transport. Bloodborne precautions, basically you would make sure the vaccinations are up to date and your equipment is properly inspected.